Welcome to Historical. I'm Casey, and tonight's story isn't for the faint of heart. It's a dark piece of history that's best heard in the dark. You've been warned. This is a story that has been told for generations in Thailand. It is a tale of love, grief, and the lines between life and death. If you have ever been to a rural area at night, you know how quickly the darkness moves in and how quiet things can get when you are far away from the city. That is where we start tonight, in a place called Phra Khanang. It is a story about a man named Mac, and it is a story that feels like something you would only hear whispered around a fire in the middle of the woods. In the early 1850s, Phra Khanang was a very isolated, quiet place. It was mostly canals, dense forests, and families living in wooden homes built on high wooden stilts to stay safe from the water and the land below. Mac was a young man from this area, and he had been away for a long time. He had been drafted into the military to fight in a war against Burma. This was not a short assignment. He was gone for nearly a full year. Before he left, his wife, Nak, was only a few months pregnant. Leaving her alone to face a pregnancy and childbirth without him was one of the hardest things he had ever done. There were no telephones or reliable ways to send letters back then, especially in a rural part of Thailand. So for the entire year, Mac had absolutely no contact with his home. He did not know if his wife was healthy. He did not know if the baby had survived. And he did not know if his wife had survived the birth. It is hard to imagine that kind of uncertainty today. But for him, it was a constant, heavy weight on his mind. To make matters worse, Mac was injured during the war and had to spend several months in a military hospital recovering. He felt completely cut off from everything he loved. He was lonely, frustrated, and deeply worried. But he kept going with the single goal of getting back to his family. When he was finally released, he traveled as fast as he could, rowing his boat through the canals of Phra Khanang. He felt a mix of intense relief and massive anxiety. He knew he was finally arriving, but he was terrified of what he might find. As he neared his house, he looked up at the wooden structure resting on its tall stilts. It was surrounded by thick green trees, and it was at least a mile away from any other neighbors. It was a place he had spent every day dreaming about. He called out for Nak, but the silence was heavy. There was no sound of a baby crying or a wife laughing. For a terrifying minute, he assumed the worst. He thought he would find an empty, ruined home. But then, the door opened. Nak walked out, clutching a baby to her chest. She had a huge, bright smile on her face, and when she saw him, she began to cry tears of joy. Mac felt an immediate wave of relief, so strong it almost made him faint. He jumped out of the boat and ran to her, finally holding his family again. For the first few days, life felt perfect. It was the kind of domestic bliss that made him forget the horrors of the war. They had a healthy baby boy, which was exactly what he had wanted. Nak was loving. She cooked all his favorite meals, and she listened to his stories about the war for hours. Mac had not left the house at all, just wanting to soak up every second of being back. He felt like the luckiest man in the world. However, things started to get strange very quickly. One morning, the kitchen was completely empty, and Mac knew he had to go to the village market to buy food. He tried to get out of bed quietly to avoid waking the baby or his wife, but as soon as he reached for the door, everything changed. Nak sat up, her eyes wide with what looked like pure panic. She grabbed his arm, pulling him back toward the bed, and shouted, "No." It was so loud that it woke the baby, who immediately began to cry. Mac was stunned. He was confused and hurt because he could not understand why she was acting this way over a simple trip to the market. He asked her what was wrong, but she just kept shaking her head, saying he could not leave. She eventually calmed down and told him that she had been alone for so long, and she was just scared to lose him again. She begged him to stay, saying that something bad would happen if he left. To Mac, this felt like an act of intense love, even if it was a bit overwhelming. He was touched that she cared so much. He tried to reason with her, explaining that they had to eat, and promised he would return in just a few minutes. He gave her a hug and a kiss, trying to reassure her. But as he turned to leave, he felt her eyes burning into his back. She did not want him to go, and it left him with a strange, lingering feeling in his stomach. Market was in the center of the village, a few miles away. When he arrived, the owner of the fruit stand was there. They were friends, or at least they had been before the war. When the owner saw Mac, his expression shifted from casual to deeply sympathetic. He looked at Mac and asked, "How are you doing?" It was an odd question, but Mac figured it was just the man acknowledging his return from the war. Mac told him everything was fine, and that he was so happy to be back with his wife and his new son. The moment the words left his mouth, the fruit stand owner's face turned from sympathy to confusion. He stared at Mac for a long time before asking, "Your wife is home?" Mac was taken aback. "Yeah, of course," he replied. "Where else would she be?" The owner looked unsettled. He shook his head, looking like he was trying to decide whether to say more. But then he just let it go. He gave an awkward, nervous shrug and changed the subject completely. It was a bizarre interaction that didn't make any sense, and it made Mac feel uneasy. When Mac returned home, he saw Nak on the balcony. She was holding the baby and staring off into space. When he called out to her, she snapped back to reality, giving him that same big, beautiful smile. She greeted him in the kitchen, appearing perfectly normal, like her panic from earlier had completely evaporated. But Mac could not stop thinking about the fruit stand owner. He brought it up while putting away the groceries. He told his wife what the man had asked, and he expected her to laugh it off. Instead, she became furious. Her face darkened, and she told him that this was exactly why she didn't want him to leave the house. She said that while he was at war, people in the village had been spreading horrible rumors about her constantly. When Mac asked what the rumors were, she refused to tell him. She just stormed out onto the balcony, leaving him standing there in total confusion. A few days later, still worried about his wife. Before he left for the war, she had been such a logical, independent, and strong woman. This new version of her paranoid, scared to let him out of her sight, and obsessed with what the neighbors were saying, felt like a stranger. He kept telling himself that it was just the result of a year of isolation and fear. Being alone with a newborn, while believing your husband is dead in a war zone, would break anyone. He figured she just needed time to adjust to his return. He was in the middle of chopping a tree when he heard footsteps. He turned around, expecting his wife, but instead saw an elderly monk in a long robe approaching him. He recognized the man as a leader from the local Buddhist temple. He assumed the monk was coming to welcome him home, so he lowered his axe and smiled. The monk did not smile back. He walked right up, looked around the forest nervously, and whispered, "Are you alone?" Mac felt his anger rising. He told the monk that he had to be confused. He knew his wife was upset about rumors, but she had been with him at the house almost every single minute since he got back. She couldn't have been out terrorizing anyone. He would have seen it. He told the monk he was mistaken, but the monk shook his head firmly. He told Mac that everyone in the village knew something was deeply wrong with his wife, everyone except for him. He warned Mac that if he was smart, he would leave his wife right now and never look back. Mac was done. He didn't believe a word of it. He decided that the villagers were just cruel, and they were the ones making his wife act this way. He picked up his firewood and walked away, feeling more protective of his wife than ever. The next morning, the conversation still stuck in his head. He was angry at the village for hurting her, but he was also frustrated that he didn't know the full story. If he knew what people were saying, he could confront them and end the rumors once and for all. He knew he couldn't ask Knack without upsetting her again, so he decided to go back to the village market and find the fruit stand owner. He was the only one who seemed to know something, and he needed to hear the truth. He snuck out while his wife was still sleeping. It was barely dawn when he reached the village, but the market was already beginning to wake up. He went to the spot where the fruit stand had been, but it was completely empty. A cold feeling settled in his chest. He didn't wait. He knew where the owner lived. He walked to the man's home, which was another wooden building on stilts, further away from the canal. He climbed the ladder and knocked. No answer. He knocked again. Still nothing. He leaned in and pressed his ear to the door, listening for any sign of life. It was completely silent. The silence felt wrong, too heavy, too still. He reached for the doorknob and pushed. The door swung open, and immediately the smell of something rancid and rotting hit him. He covered his nose with his hand, calling out for the owner, his voice trembling. He walked further into the home, his eyes scanning the shadows. He looked down at the floor and froze. The fruit stand owner was lying there, covered in blood. He was dead. Mac turned and ran. He flew down the ladder, his heart hammering against his ribs. He knew he should go to the village authorities, but but his mind raced to his wife. He had no evidence, but he had that lingering, sick feeling that if he told anyone, they would blame her. Without thinking, he started running back toward his house. He slowed down as he approached, hoping to slip inside before she woke up. He was close enough to see the balcony. Knack was awake, standing there with the baby on her hip. She hadn't seen him yet. She was looking at the lime tree that hung over the railing. She reached up to grab a lime, but she fumbled it. The fruit fell through a small gap in the floorboards and landed on the ground 7 feet below. Mac watched her. It was a normal thing to happen. He expected her to go get another one or just walk away. But she didn't. She knelt down, and he watched in absolute, paralyzed horror as her arm began to stretch. It didn't look like a normal movement. It looked robotic, unnatural. Her arm extended downward, reaching through the floorboards, stretching and stretching, until it was 7 feet long, reaching all the way to the ground to grab the lime. He heard a sickening, dry, crackling sound as her arm retracted, pulling back up through the floorboards to her body. She turned and looked directly at him. Her face wasn't the face of the woman he loved. Mac didn't wait. He didn't ask questions. He turned and sprinted toward the village temple. He pounded on the doors until the monks let him in, begging them to hide him. Once he was inside, he finally felt safe. The monks gathered around him as he broke down, sobbing and trying to explain what he had just seen. He told them about the arm, about the stretching, about the fear. The monks listened silently, their faces grave. Finally, the same monk who had warned him in the forest came forward. He told Mac it was time for the truth. He looked at Mac and said they had to do something painful. They needed his permission to dig up his wife's grave. The village had known the truth all along. When Mac was away at war, Knack and their baby had both died during childbirth. They had been buried for months. The woman he had been living with, the one who cooked his meals and begged him not to leave, was a ghost. She was a spirit so tethered to her love for her husband that she had refused to leave the world of the living. She hadn't been terrorizing the village because she was evil. She was doing it because she wanted to protect the life she had created with him. And anyone who threatened that anyone who got too close to the truth was a target. Mac finally understood. He gave the monks permission. They exhumed the grave, and they performed a ritual to release her spirit. They carved a small piece of her skull and kept it, which was believed to be the only way to trap the ghost and allow her to move on. Even today, in Phra Kanang, there is a shrine dedicated to Knack. Some people see her as a terrifying spirit that should be avoided, but others see her as something else. They see her as a symbol of a love so deep and so desperate that it refused to end, even after death. It is a story that stays with you, especially when you are standing near a canal in the quiet of the night, wondering if the person standing next to you is truly who they say they are.